Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Alight team. Welcome, friends and supporters, board members. It's so nice to see so many of your faces and so many of your names today on this incredible day. So, as many of you know, Monday was World Refugee Day, and at Alight, every day is dedicated to how we can best show up for displaced people and meet their needs with human-centered care. World Refugee Day every year for us is a moment where we can further amplify this mission and elevate the stories of refugees and expand our own understanding. Today, we're honoring World Refugee Day with an amazing speaker who's a refugee and migrant expert, and we'll be discussing the major impact that climate change has on displacement and how it affects the communities that we serve at Alight. So here to share her research and expertise with us today is Amali Tower. Amali is the founder and executive director of Climate Refugees, which is an independent nonprofit created to help people who have been displaced across borders as a result of climate change. Amali has extensive global experience in refugee protection, resettlement, and forced migration, and has worked for many NGOs, UN Refugee Agency, UN Refugees Admissions Programs, has years of interviewing refugees fleeing conflicts, and has helped unearth the stories of refugees fleeing climate change, through which Climate Refugees was born. Amali's research on climate conflict and displacement in the Lake Chad Basin in the African Sahel has been selected as evidence of loss and damage presented at COP26 in Glasgow. She's a member of the World Economic Forum Expert Network in Migration, Human Rights, and Humanitarian Response. She's frequently consulted for her expertise from Afghan evacuations to Syrian resettlement. Amali frequently consults in the areas of human rights, campaigning, advocacy, legislation, and public policy. Amali developed her work ethic, her worldviews, and her deep commitment to forcibly displaced populations through lived experience of instability as an immigrant, migrant, and even once as an asylum seeker. These experiences, life in multiple countries, and her education at top universities has shaped who she is. Amali has a Master's of International Affairs focused in human rights from Columbia University, a Bachelor's of Arts in International Development from UCLA, an International Diploma in Humanitarian Assistance from Fordham University. She has lived and worked in 18 countries and has helped refugee and migrant populations in the United States as well. Amali currently resides in New York City. So thank you, Amali, for joining us, and I will turn it over to you to share some thoughts and perspectives on this incredibly pertinent topic to all of us today.
Well, thank you, Jocelyn. That's really kind. I'm really honored to be here with all of you here today. It's really an amazing opportunity and really a delight to be with my community, with fellow humanitarians. And it's really great that Alight has taken this opportunity to talk about the role of climate change in forced displacement. On a day when we're honoring, but I would say also commemorating World Refugee Day. I say commemorating because it's a reminder to mark this day today, because we now have 100 million displaced people in the world. That is not just a number, that is 1.3% of the global population. Or if that was a country, that would be the 14th most populous country in the world. Most of those people are in the global south, are people from global south, developing countries. Over 86% of those people are housed in the global south, which means they are in countries that are already at the front lines of climate change, of poverty, of conflict, of underdevelopment. We're terribly going in the wrong direction, and we have been for over 12 years. I've lost track of the amount of years in which we have the highest numbers of forced displacement since World War II. And as you all well know, in my community here, We have the 1951 Refugee Convention because of the issues and crises that arose out of World War II. So I do want to say that we're not just honoring refugees. I think we do as a community also have to recognize that we're commemorating where we're at today as a community. Now, of that 100 million, about 30 million people are refugees. The vast majority then remain asylum seekers, internally displaced, and persons of concern. Persons of concern is just a very wide category that UNHCR uses, right? So I would ask them, but what about those that are climate displaced? Well, they have no particular category, so they're not even in here. Even if climate change is now rapidly one of the primary drivers of forced displacement, this is not a category that's recognized. Therefore, keep in mind with everything I say today, they do not encompass the 100 million people that we're talking about today. 2021 numbers tell us that 30.7 million people were internally displaced by climate change. That is more than 3 times as many people than conflict or violence. In fact, since 2008, we have seen a steady trajectory of climate displacement of 20 to 23 million per year. Yet, we lack governance frameworks to adequately address this forced displacement, and we lack policy frameworks to address the climate crisis. The climate crisis is a colonial crisis. I think we cannot mince words about this. The global north countries and about 100 or so corporations in the global north, who are still essentially holding the world hostage to a system that is deeply flawed. We have a migrant and refugee crisis as well. The migrants and the refugees aren't the crisis. It's the response to them that is the crisis. This is equally perpetuated by some of the very systemic failures instituted by these very same countries. Both these crises are being felt by populations in the global south who had almost no role in their creation. Populations that are amongst the poorest, most marginalized, and disenfranchised people on the planet. They're the people we as humanitarians serve, and we need to be better advocates for the suffering that these systems oppress upon them. From my vantage, I would say we also have a crisis of apathy. I recently heard fellow humanitarian and applied neuroscientist Mike Nickerchuk. Maybe some of you know him. He's a good friend of mine. He explained why we as humans seemingly care about some things or some people over others. And I really was moved by what Mike had to say. Mike says the human brain last evolved about 40,000 years ago. So stop and think about how much has happened in our human history, our collective human history over the last 40,000 years, right? How much progress, how much civilization, how much history, positive, good things, right? And then think about the fact that our brains have not evolved in all that time frame. So what does this mean? This means that we're hardwired to respond to us by essentially 2 things: value-based decisions and fear. This is a scientific fact that neuroscientists will tell you. What motivates us to take action based on those 2, value-based decisions and fear, are threats. Threats to status, to identity, and existential threats. I would say that climate change very much falls within that, right? Neuroscientists say that if those 3 things are not in play, we're not likely to be moved to action. So for me, this is key information that we must pause to think about if we are to be effective humanitarians and advocates, and to tackle the complex and multiple crises that are in front of us. It's always been very clear to me that until the impacts of the climate crisis are felt as deeply in Western countries as they are right now in global South countries, change will be elusive. And I think that's clear. That's demonstrably clear by the policies that we all see instituted. The climate crisis and the migration crisis are 2 of the most critical and interlinked issues of our time. So keeping these neural realities in mind, we need to put people at the center of our responses if we are to ensure that human rights are protected even as the world changes all around us, because people are certainly missing at the core of the policymaking conversations. Right now, we're all very worried about food security, especially about wheat availability due to the Ukraine conflict, and rightly so. But climate-driven drought has also risen 29% just this century. And I doubt any of us have heard that before. Right now, 13 million people are staring down famine in the Horn of Africa, in the worst drought to hit the region in 40 years. Somalia is completely 100% dependent on Russia and Ukraine for its wheat. Somalia may have a fourth, some say fifth, failed rainy season, where now 75% of new human displacements are climate-driven. The situation in Somalia is so desperate that people are displaced internally and across borders, and have been for many years, as you all well know, since 1991. But these new climate-driven displacements, wait for it. Imagine where people are being displaced across borders to: Yemen, Ethiopia, Kenya, and more. Can you imagine being Somali and being forced to flee to Yemen and Ethiopia, two of the biggest humanitarian crises on our planet today, and this is your better choice? That's how bad things are. Recently, I had an illuminating conversation with the first UN climate advisor to Somalia, Christoph Hodder. This is the first appointment of such to any UN peacekeeping or political mission. And I'd like to play you a small clip from that conversation now that Alyssa has very kindly queued up for you. So I will pause for a minute and let you all listen to that. Chris, what are the displaced populations saying, both internally as well as cross-border to Yemen, Kenya, Ethiopia? What are they disclosing maybe as their primary driver of displacement? Conflict or climate or poverty or?
Yeah, so really, actually, interestingly, more and more now, displaced population are saying that that climate change is a primary driver of displacement. But like I said, displacement is multifaceted, it's complicated, and like I said, you might be displaced one time due to conflict, and then you may return, and then you get displaced by flooding or drought. But really, displaced populations are saying more and more now. And when you listen to Radio Ergo or some of these national radio programs, climate change is coming up as a major issue that everybody is talking about. And so I think that really harnessing the youth, is a big driver in Somalia. In the youth around environment protection, replanting trees, and there are solutions to this. It's not a dire situation that we just got to give up. Rewilding, replanting, going together, working together to try to really find solutions to things like drylands, and there are projects in Puntland area that are really exciting around dryland solutions that really do provide changes in ecosystem that can provide water and grazing lands to communities, bringing back traditional knowledges around grazing lands and moving cattle and livestock, that can regenerate areas. I think there's some really exciting movements from the youth, and the Somali population is incredibly entrepreneurial as well. Meeting people, business owners that are looking at seaweed for alternatives to plastics. There's people looking at plant tree nurseries and working with schools around education. There's movements around protecting these age-old trees and those sort of things. So there's a lot going on, and it's really exciting. And that's where we've got to try to put the hope of the future in those movements. Eva?
Okay. Thank you, Alyssa, for playing that video. I just wanted you to be able to hear that, directly from Chris, and more importantly, hear some of the solutions that he's talking about, which I think would be very helpful to your work, especially not just in Somalia, but the Horn and many other places. Now, to return to my comments, Africa is hit particularly hard by climate stress, but certainly not just Africa. 2.3 billion people face water stress right now. That's 1/3 of humanity. 216 million people could become internal climate migrants by 2050 per the World Bank. The projections for climate displacement are anywhere from 250 million to 1.3 billion people. I would say from my standpoint, it's really not so much about the projections as it is the alarming lack of projections. And there's far too much focus on projections to the detriment of refugees and migrants, because then it really focuses everything about xenophobic and anti-migrant hostilities rather than solutions. Now, the scale that I'm talking about, just the 216 million that the World Bank has talked about that are internal climate migrations in 6 different regions that they've projected, that is a scale 40 times greater than the Ukraine crisis at present. And yet, even in the face of all this current despair, the global north is solely focused on Ukraine at the moment, to the detriment of even these crises, for which it has enormous responsibility, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I welcome the focus on Ukraine. You know, I mean, this is exactly what I've advocated my whole life for. As someone who responded to the Afghan evacuations, as someone who's now seeing the Ukraine response, and who has responded to so many other humanitarian crises and disasters, as you all have as well, I welcome this outpouring. It's what all refugees and all crises deserve. I only ask, where is the same attention and focus for other equally dire crises and people that must garner our equal attention? Today, I'm mindful of a refugee mother in Somalia who once told me, where is there to go back to? That was her response when I said, why did you leave your country? Or why can't you return? And this is someone who had already been displaced for nearly 20 years. She said, where is there to go back to? We have no land. We have no animals. Our crops failed for 5 years before we even went to Mogadishu. A fisherman in Nigeria, now a refugee in Niger, said he was first displaced by climate change as early as 1973. That's what he said to me. Well before the conflict with Boko Haram that eventually forced him out of his country in 2015. And for those who can't move, because migration is expensive, it's mostly for able-bodied people. Migration is a young man's game, an elderly Moroccan man just recently told me. Today, over 90% of global refugees come from countries most vulnerable to climate change. And in this reality, European countries, the US, Canada, Australia, shutter their borders to anyone that looks like me. There's no dispute, there's no shock there. Climate change multiplies vulnerabilities that push people from their homes. Climate change does not act alone to displace people or push them to migrate, but it is certainly increasing vulnerabilities and the many drivers that are forcing people to have to migrate as a means of adaptation. And yet the countries most responsible for the climate crisis are prioritizing border security over human security. The combined border security budgets of 7 of the biggest polluters, developed countries with the highest greenhouse gas emissions historically, is almost double that which they are spending on climate finance to help developing countries shore up their resiliency to adapt to these adverse effects of climate change. And I would add, in complete contravention to the very climate pledges they've made and to the UNFCCC, that's the UN Framework on Climate Change Convention, to the commitment to have a common but differentiated responsibility to help developing countries actually shore up their resilience now. So this is in complete contravention to international law as well. It's not just hypocrisy, it's not just, you know, an amoral situation, it's also an illegal situation. But again, we lack the robust international frameworks to take action. At the individual level, these budget discrepancies are shockingly asymmetrical, even though these very same countries pledged to provide $100 billion in climate finance annually in 2009. It's 2022, this money has yet to materialize. The time for climate adaptation finance has sailed. We are now in the era of loss and damage. And what that means is we have reached an era in which we no longer can avert, minimize, and adequately address the effects of climate change on the most disproportionate populations in the global south. So now we've reached another pillar in which anywhere from about 500 to 800 billion dollars is going to be needed annually for the global south to actually respond to the losses and damages of which the most the biggest loss and damage is forced displacement. Clearly, I would say, developed countries must know then that climate change is driving people across borders, hence their decision to securitize borders, beef up surveillance, push back asylum seekers, externalize borders, send them back to their death, discriminate who comes to their countries on the basis of race and nationality, and offshore asylum, as we're seeing in US third country agreements, the EU agreements. Just look at Turkey, look at Libya, look at the UK borders bill with Rwanda. We also have to talk about structural inequalities. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change now even acknowledges the role of colonialism in the climate crisis, calling for systemic change in economic policies and capital markets that widen inequality, poverty, and base the global economy on the burning of fossil fuels. Recall that the first IPCC report in 1990 warned that the greatest effects of climate change will be migration. And I've already told you about a Nigerian refugee in the Lake Chad Basin who told me about their first climate displacement in 1973. Multiple people told me that. Yet for 32 years, we've had almost no actions on lowering emissions, funding climate adaptation, developing migrant protections, expanding refugee protections. Why? Because of global North power, lack of empathy, trust, and systemic failures. I'd go a step further and call for changes that address the structural violence and injustice that such systems perpetuate. Across the world, the climate crisis disproportionately impacts the poor, women, marginalized, minority, indigenous, and people of color. For example, women make up about 80% of climate refugees because of the discrimination women suffer all over the world. This demonstrates the structural inequalities that underpin the disproportionate impacts on frontline and global South communities. People with the top 1% highest incomes globally, a group of about 63 million, emit about twice the amount of carbon emissions as those with incomes in the bottom 50%. That's the equivalent of about 3.1 billion people. And in all this, absent in the solutions and deliberations are the people most affected. The populations most affected need to be central to deliberations in both climate and migration arenas. Take Central America, a region highly climate vulnerable, where today climate change is a major driver of displacement and migration, both internally and across borders, including to the US southern border, which is why the Biden administration asked for a report that looks at the impacts of climate change on forced displacement, on migration, on planned relocation, and on resettlement. We haven't gone very far with that, but it recognizes the impacts of climate change in Central America. Now, migrants and asylum seekers are forced to live out in the streets today. I'm sorry to say, but like animals. I've been there, I've been multiple times to these encampments, and it is amongst some of the worst encampments I've ever seen. All this for their right to mobility, their right to seek asylum. To understand the climate impacts, we have to understand the political economy of this region as well, rooted in neoliberal economic policies, deeply entrenched in colonial legacies, like the Central America Free Trade Agreement, which privileges the United States and developed countries over the farmers, indigenous people, and those at the front lines of the climate crisis. Why do I mention this? Because the response of the Biden administration that asked for that executive order on looking at forced displacement and climate change, the response has been a root cause strategy from the VP's office that's been basically about development, that's been using these very same free trade agreements that are completely asymmetrical to the very migrants who are coming to the US southern border. So we have this disconnect in the reality and the response. And we are the community that has to speak these truths. So here I am. This underpins their climate displacement. And now to dismiss it is not to see the full picture and the full suite of solutions here. I've been very vocal about these things, not just to you, but to the Biden administration. CAFTA introduced starvation wages. It helped landed elites, large farms, agribusinesses, multinational corporations like Coca-Cola, Nestle, Monsanto, who monopolize the best land and resources. Something disastrous during this climate crisis, where indigenous populations, historically marginalized, killed on the basis of their ethnicity, lack land tenure and adaptive capacity to the increasing drought, land degradation, scorching temperatures, hurricanes, alongside widening inequality, poverty, food insecurity, violence, and criminal activity. CAFTA effectively killed subsistence farming, created thousands more landless poor farmers who were forced to move to urban centers, enter climate impacts, and it's a recipe for disasters in more ways than one. Then there's country income classifications. Take the small island developing states in the Pacific Rim. Consider this from the UN about small island developing states. Most SIDS that are among the most vulnerable to climate impacts are not the poorest nations because of their high income country classifications based on Bretton Woods institutions, right? Like the World Bank and the IMF. So what does this mean? SIDS are responsible for 0.2% of the global carbon emissions and yet suffer the most from the impact of climate change. They're literally sinking. SIDS countries, climate costs are so much greater, and when disasters strike and tourism, which is what their economies are based on, are decimated, now add COVID, now add the global economic impacts that we're all going through, their economies are completely devastated. Accessing finance for them, they don't get finance. They have to take loans. They go into odious cycles of debt. They cannot come out of this. To think this is an environmental problem only is a massive mistake. What we need is to establish a vulnerability index that looks at the whole picture. What we also need is refugee understanding outside of a colonial lens. The 1951 Refugee Convention excludes anyone fleeing their country for reasons outside of conflict or persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, social group, right? You all know this. It's purposefully narrow and it's reductive because the powers that be after World War II determined to limit it for political expediency. Let's not forget this very convention once limited refugees only to those fleeing Europe during a specific duration of time. And why was that geographic limitation lifted in 1967? The breakdown of colonial pasts. So was this generosity of Western states or culpability for colonial legacies? I would say it was quid pro quo. And can we not say then that we are in a similar situation now where a handful of Western nations or global North countries are responsible for the climate crisis, disproportionately inflicted on marginalized people? In this context, in October 2020, UNHCR finally provided some legal guidance on situations where the Geneva Convention can apply in climate displacement contexts. Despite that, countries remain reticent and border security has remained sacrosanct over human security. Equally, in 2018, countries adopted the Global Compact for Migration, which included recognizing cross-border forced migration for reasons of climate change, and that countries would ensure all migrant protections under human rights law to those arriving from climate displacement to their countries. I'm sorry to say that despite this 5 years later, we've just concluded the first review of this compact and the protections afforded are slim to none. The EU has ensured even more border security and migrant deaths in the Mediterranean has doubled last year. You all know about the Central Americans locked. I've talked to you about that for the past 2 years, driven by violence, poverty, climate change, and very likely having legitimate asylum claims as well. They're denied that right to seek asylum, let alone basic dignity. But in this very same context, let's also not forget, the US did offer entry to Ukrainians at the US border, while still denying Haitians, Central Americans, and other non-European nationals at the exact same time. We just have to look at the full picture and recognize that this is what's happening. This is the landscape of forced displacement today. As I said, it's reductive and unhelpful to pretend that people migrate for single issues. Migration, even in situations of full agency, are usually the result of various drivers, both push and pull factors, and you all know this. We need systems that ensure both the protection of people who are forcibly displaced and the protection of people who have a right to stay. More and more, we live in times where people are not afforded choice. To pretend otherwise is folly. The simple fact is that migrants lack any legal definition and are perceived as moving by choice. Nothing could be further from the truth. Migrants today are so unclassified, we have no idea how many migrants there really are. We also have no idea then how many of them are forcibly migrating and how much of that is climate driven. Refugees are no different, for climate is playing a huge role in their forced displacement. And yet we have a system that ensures that that particular driver is unrecognized. Clearly, we need to do better, and the call for bold leadership and the necessary change must come from within our community. At a tactical level, we have to ensure that climate change is incorporated in every single level of our program, ensuring our donors recognize that locally based solutions must be centered with the people of color, marginalized, and disenfranchised communities leading the core efforts. No more should we be talking about the voices of the voiceless. These communities have voices. They are ensuring their own resiliency with very few resources. They have the solutions, they know the solutions because they're on the front lines. All we need to do is listen and follow. They can actually be teaching us if we'd only allow it. Our work must ensure that we are facilitating that their voices are heard and represented at every level and every fora in the international community for solutions grounded in justice and people-centered responses that actually work. I'll leave it here. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you in an engaging discussion. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you for being on the front lines, fighting for justice. It's an honor to join you on this World Refugee Day.
Thank you so much, Amali. What an inspiring and moving talk. I think we're all charged to take action, and I think there's so much that Alight can do in our work around the world. I just thought that the connections that you made between displacement and climate change were so strong, and I think you're right. This is a time that we have to act. And so, before we get started in Q&A, and we will have time for Q&A, so please put questions in the chat, or we'll be able to come off mute and invite you to share your questions directly or any reflections. But first, wanted to call in a couple of our colleagues, Zainab and Heidi, to share just some reflections on how they see what Amali shared playing out in the Horn of Africa, in Somalia, and in Sudan, and how Alight is responding to some of these challenges. So Zainab, let's start with you and hear a little bit about what you're seeing in Somalia.
Hi.
And your baby.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Zainab. I'm the communications manager for the Horn of Africa team. This is Zeki. He's the communications intern. So definitely the topic of climate change has been talked about a lot more recently. And Amali, you touched on this, but we in Somalia and in the Horn, we have this constant cycle. There's a season of really severe drought, and it's horrible, and thousands of people lose their lives, and millions of people end up malnourished, and then people end up displaced because they go towards cities in search of food and water. And then, like clockwork, rainy season starts, but instead of being a godsend, it ends up being severe flooding and disease outbreak and all of these other horrible things. And then in the region, we have 2 rainy seasons. So it starts with a failed rain, then a horrible drought, then flooding, then failed rain, then horrible drought, then flooding. So it's this cycle that continues and continues. And of course, there are practices that happen here that contribute to that contribute to climate change as a whole. One being the production of charcoal and things like that. But I feel like when we talk so much about ending charcoal production or planting trees or even giving people a livelihood so they don't rely on those things, we're almost putting the onus on the people for this huge global issue. And Amali, I like how you really named it and talked about colonialism, because of course the issues in Somalia are so much a legacy of colonialism. And when we talk about being in a 3 decades long civil war and 1991, this conflict started even before 1991. My parents fled Somalia in 1987. So it has just been this, probably almost going towards 4 decades of conflict that is directly a result of the colonial legacy in the region. And the ongoing colonialism, when every few weeks there's airstrikes by American military in Somalia, when other countries are dumping toxic waste on the shorelines of Somalia, and then coupled with now xenophobia, where fishermen who are defending themselves are called pirates, but that's another issue. And in the 90s, Western countries were taking refugees in huge amounts. But now xenophobia, Islamophobia, and all of these things, it just, people are ending up being displaced in neighboring countries. So I'm here in Kenya, not displaced in Kenya. I came here on my own, but we have all these issues where people are being displaced in Yemen, and then Yemeni refugees are coming to Somalia. So to see that kind of two-way displacement is just something really, really shocking. So I think those are my thoughts, but I think my question is, how can we take the conversation away from what can we do to stop climate change into this bigger conversation of how can we deal with these global forces that are contributing to it? So that's all from us.
Thanks so much, Zainab. That was really, really helpful reflections. Amali, do you want to address that question before we move on?
Absolutely. I have a word for you, all of you, just transition. This is the key word that we all need to hammer and hammer hard. The international community, and when I say international community, let me be very clear. I'm talking about the reticent global north complicit countries, right? We're talking about Europe, United States, Canada, Australia. We know who all the bad actors are, and they're also our donors. So we're in a pickle, guys. We're all in a pickle. But we know, how can we continue to put band-aids on situations? As Zainab just said, you've got Yemenis coming to Somalia, you've got Somalis going to Yemenis. So what are we doing here? We're just distributing aid and putting band-aids on people. We're not solving anything. Billions of dollars are going towards making people feel marginally better. And it's 4 decades of this complicity, which I mean, I know I can't do this anymore. I know none of us can. So yes, we don't have to say these things in our meetings. We can say this in the privacy of our community, right? But we all know that this is what's happening. So do our policymakers, and there are lots of friends within the policy world who know what the situation is and want to change it. How do you do that? You advocate for just transition. Take what Zainab was just saying about coal. Why I talk so much about structural and systemic inequalities and poverty and the systemic failures is because how do you deal with the climate crisis if you don't also adequately address poverty? If you only look at Somalia in the context of just, oh, well, this is conflict and maybe there's a bit of climate change happening too, you would completely miss, well, what's the role of poverty? And how on earth can you ask a Somali woman to deal with, or how do you feel about climate change and how is it impacting you? I guarantee you, people will say climate change, I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure out whether I'm going to be able to feed my child today. I'm not worried about climate change. Populations who are the most affected by this aren't even sure whether climate change is a massive problem for them because the poverty is so visceral. So when you're going to say to this very same person, I'm sorry, we really need you to lower your emissions, so could you just not use your coal? What? That would be a solution that is completely devoid of the reality that this is a person who lives on, gosh, not just less than $1 a day, less than 50 cents a day, right? So do you see how the disconnect, the complete lack of understanding of the framework, of the reality of what this Somali woman is going through? So the buzzword here is just transition. At the global level, what we're all advocating for is, the hypocrisy of it is we're not asking for Somalia, who has 0.00, by the way, is its global emissions. Somalia has nothing to do with lowering it has no climate mitigation. So anytime you see the international community asking Somalia to please not use coal, push back and say, oh, okay, great international community. How would you like to solve the endemic poverty that's 50+ years ongoing, where this is the maternal mortality? And that's how you fight back. Bring up all the social and development indicators and you say, what's your response to that? Because I'm sorry, climate change is not happening in a vacuum. So just transition. No developing country should be mitigating or lowering its emissions to the detriment of its own human development.
Yeah, so well said, Amali. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to turn next to Heidi, who's our country director in Sudan, to share a little bit on reflections of what Amali shared and how she's seeing that play out in Sudan.
Great. Hi, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Amali, for your comments. A lot resonated. And as everybody on this call probably knows, I could speak for an hour or more. So I will try to be very brief. And I did ask our deputy, Idris, who is Sudanese, if he would like to speak, because it's not lost on me that I am a white American working in Sudan and feel equally strong about the comments about colonialism and the role of the countries that you've mentioned in the plight of the global South. He deferred and asked me to take the lead. So what I do want to note is that Sudan, while not part of the Horn of Africa, is suffering equally as the rest of East Africa is, both from a drought, from floods, and from being number 7 in the world in hosting refugees. We have 1.1 million refugees in Sudan. 800,000 plus are South Sudanese refugees. And Alight is the second largest responder to the displacement, IDP and refugee crisis and humanitarian crisis in Sudan. Climate change is definitely a major factor in Sudan. Sudan prior to colonialism and its independence was independence from British rule, was 70% was involved in agriculture, and it was known as the food basket to the world. The European countries helped make sure that that legacy shifted over the last 50 years. And so Sudan today is an extremely complex and difficult country, both to do humanitarian work, but more importantly, to flee if you are a refugee, or to be a Sudanese trying to make a living day to day. The just transition that you speak of, I think, is exactly what it is. I found it what needs to be advocated for. We need people to be activists for it, and then we need people to be advocates for it. There's a role for all of us. I'm more of an advocate, so I love data. I am not afraid to sit across from a donor and call a spade, and I do it backing it up with, or we do it backing it up with data. What I will say is that that in Sudan, for the first time in more than 30 years, there's a sorghum shortage that's directly related to climate change. That's directly related to the droughts in especially in the South. Similar to what Zainab was telling us, Sudan is consistently in a cycle of drought, then flood, then drought, then flood. In 2020, 100,000 homes were lost in Khartoum, which is the capital in a city of over 5 million. Most refugees are out of camps. Alight provides services to nearly 400,000, maybe 350,000 refugees annually. That's part of a total population of over 1.5 million that we serve. We do work in 7 camps in 4 states. We've started a program in West Kordofan that is more transitional and peace building, which is bringing in South Sudanese refugees to work side by side with Sudanese to help rebuild the healthcare system, which also was destroyed as a result of the history of Sudan and colonialism, and then the myriad of coups. It's had the most coups of any country in the world, the myriad of coups as well as political instability. There's hyperinflation. The poverty is enormous. There is hyperinflation with a Sudanese pound that is exceptionally undervalued against the USD. And we have a public health crisis every season, it seems. We have a tremendous malaria outbreak. We have a cholera outbreak now on the border with South Sudan. And we have all sorts of public health issues that are directly related to the poverty, the transient nature of a lot of the population displaced and then redisplaced, and then also the lack of any kind of infrastructure to deal with these issues. The irony is that the countries in which many of us come from close borders to people who need support, and places like Sudan, whose own people are truly suffering, keep their borders open, and indeed open their arms and their homes. Many communities even open their homes and welcome displaced populations in, not only from Africa, but they did to the Syrians as well, and call them their brothers and sisters. And so if I sound passionate with an edge of anger in my voice, it's because I am. And I do believe that now is the time. There is dialogue. Yes, the Ukrainian crisis has all the love, if you will. We were told that there is not going to be any money for East Darfur or East Sudan next year because of Ukraine. That all of the humanitarian response money will be shifted to Ukraine and to Europe. I said to my staff, I don't think that's true. I think that's a red herring, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that's not true. And so, as I said, I could go on, and I apologize because I'm very passionate about this. I'm also back from leave, so I'm ready to go. But one other point that I think is really important, well, there were two more other points, and I promise I'll stop talking. One is that I think it's critical to talk about climate change in the overarching umbrella of conflict and displacement. In Sudan, climate change is, as well as other places, but my lens right now is Sudan. Climate change is affecting malnutrition. We're seeing rates go up again for the first time in 30 years. But it's also affecting conflict, and it's a driver of conflict. It's a driver of poverty. It's a driver of hunger. It's a driver of disease. It's also a driver of conflict. We have nomads that are livestock farmers that they migrate from the south through Darfur up to East Sudan every year. And with the crops being fewer, the water being less, they are going onto farmers' lands and creating conflict. People are being killed. We're seeing an increase in conflict in Darfur, the entire region, for the first time in 5 years. And so climate change in and of itself is a driver of displacement, but many other factors also that drive more displacement are directly related to climate change. The second thing is, and I guess a reflection would be, if the neuroscientists say that two drivers of change or action are fear as well as value-based, well, we know about fear. I mean, we're seeing an uptick in fear and what that is doing to the world taking care of each other. But what about the value-based? How can we lean on value-based? What about the collective humanity? What about the fact that turning away from anyone who's fleeing their country is ethically and morally, I would say, criminal, but that's because I'm passionate about it. As you were speaking, I got a WhatsApp from a refugee or a displaced person, a Tigrayan Ethiopian, and he wanted to show me the sign he made for World Refugee Day that says, World Refugee Day that said, no one leaves home unless ... home is the mouth of a shark. And he was staying there with his Alight World Refugee Day shirt on. And so making sure that we have that at the forefront of everything that we do when we talk about the people we serve. I get emotional about it. So I really liked hearing the value-based and fear. And value-based doesn't have to be something that is a moral judgment. It just means, what do we believe as humanitarians as well as humanity? And that's where we should be, from my perspective, taking step toward action. So thank you. I talked too long. I'm sorry, Jocelyn and everyone, but I appreciate it. And please remember that Sudan is part of East Africa. Sudan is suffering the same plight of our brothers and sisters in the Horn of Africa. And we are equally in need of advocacy and activism. Thanks.
Thank you, Heidi. Really appreciate that. Your passion certainly comes through. We had a few questions. Nasria had raised her hand previously, so I am going to call on her to come off mute and ask her question first, and then we had a couple in the chat.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you, Amali. This is Nasria Pashtun. I'm an Afghan refugee living in Pakistan right now, and I'm privileged to be a part of the Allied family now. Colleagues already, like Zainab and Hadi, have already touched upon the health, poverty, food crisis, and the other basic things, but I want to divert the conversation towards something else, because the expert is here, and I have a question. Is that I migrated from my country and I was forced to leave my country, but my question is regarding how this migration of people is different from urban versus rural. I mean, many Afghans were forced to leave their country when Taliban took over last year in August. But if you look at the from the lens of urban and rural area, many urban people who were living in urban areas and city, they left, the educated one, the workforce, the experienced one. It caused a huge brain drain back home, I mean, in Afghanistan. But in rural areas, it kind of did not had most effect when Taliban took over. I know it's a very different scenario, it's not a war. But when it comes to the climate change that we talked about, that's where the rural area is more affected. For example, last year when the drought, some of the provinces were hit by a severe droughts, others were hit by floods. There were some internal displacement, and they had to move and settle in different parts of the country. So my question would be that, do you look at this migration or the refugee crisis, urban versus rural, or it's more like on the global level? Thank you.
Do you want me to answer them right now, Jocelyn, or take a couple?
Yeah, we have 3 questions. Why don't you take this one quickly, and then we can try and get to the other 2 before we wrap up.
So no, there's the short answer, Nazreen, is no. There's no distinction between, like, because that would be almost like to equate, well, not equate, but like to differentiate as if one is better than the other or less deserving, or it's not like that. Let me just pause it by saying that, generally speaking, migration movements work in the following way. Rural to urban migration is generally how things tend to go in a climate context, but not only. Let me give you a great example that really juxtaposes the climate conflict scenario, which is what this landscape looks like. Because keep in mind, if 90% of all refugees are coming from climate-driven contexts, or climate fragile countries, then that should tell us something about conflict as well, right? Syria, in Drought, 800,000 people moved from Drought into Damascus, which, by the way, the international community completely missed. So great job, right? Like, this is showing you, well, if we're all paying attention to the Middle East and this is where all the trillions of dollars go, that's a pretty big thing to miss. Now, did that cause all the Syrian uprising and the Assad regime's, human rights responses, atrocities? No. But did it do a lot to greatly destabilize, right, all the sort of like triggers that were part of that conflict? Absolutely. Absolutely. And there have been many Syrian refugees that I've spoken to and interviewed who have talked about, because there was 5-6 years of a consistent drought in the Fertile Crescent. This is the breadbasket of the world. So, or at least of the Middle East. So that would be an example for you of rural to urban migration. Afghanistan, Nazreen, you're going to have to remind me, it's 34 or 32 provinces. Every single one of the provinces of Afghanistan has had a natural disaster, multiple. Over 50% of Afghanistan today is food insecure because of climate-driven drought. And yet all the attention is on conflict, right? And the political instability. Not to say that that's not where it needs to be, but it speaks to the problem in looking at things in a siloed way, and also in differentiating, is there a distinction between rural and urban migration, as if that diminishes the protection needs of anybody any less. If anything, what happens is migration costs a ton of money. So someone in a rural area is likely going to have a lot less money than someone in an urban area. So they're likely to be more trapped in a place that has far fewer resources, options, opportunities, and therefore they're going to have more protection needs than someone in an urban center. An urban center is going to be a little bit more elite, more educated, have more access, more opportunities. And that's the internal sort of migration frame landscape, if you will. Eventually, when protection needs go unmet, people do cross borders. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Amali. All right, I'm going to combine the two questions that we have, one from Molly at Alight and one from Gerald, into a single question for you before we go, which is really sort of looking for solutions. So Gerald is curious in particular about what businesses can do to support. And so if you've seen any opportunities where businesses are connecting with refugees or refugee organizations in support of climate migrants, I'm interested in hearing about that. Molly's asking about one sort of doable intervention that you maybe have seen implemented that could be inspiring to us. So any one or two great examples of solutions that you've seen that we can follow.
Yes, so businesses have lately started to express some interest and in wanting to talk to me about, climate displacement. And I think they're just as perplexed in terms of where on earth do we start. I'm always reticent and a little bit cautious because I have no reason to believe that businesses have nothing but the best of intentions in wanting to support, but they don't generally tend to approach this in the same holistic framework I'm coming from, which is to say that, listen, it's perfectly fine for you to want to be a profit-making entity, but we're talking about people whose lives have been upended. So we can't turn this into a cottage industry, right? When it comes to climate change, businesses tend to look at innovations. They think that technology and innovations are going to solve our way out of this crisis. That is simply not going to get it done. We need to change the way we live. Quite simply, there are a handful of us on this planet that are absolutely selfish, and that crosses race and nationality lines because we're choosing to not change the way we live. So the role that businesses can play most importantly is to call for systemic change. That means kind of going to war with your own entity and your own industry, which is to say, do we need to make as much profit as we are? What I have gone on the record as saying, and if you Google me, you'll see I've spoken to several business journalists now, and I'm on the record as saying, you cannot turn sustainability into a cottage industry. We're not going to innovate our way out of this. If you want to work, specifically with displaced populations, solar cookers and these things aren't going to necessarily get it done. You need to be looking at grand scale solutions. You heard Chris talking about alternatives like seaweed, right? You heard Zainab talking about how do you transition out of coal? Okay, you need to bring the just transition model that we're actually advocating for at the UNFCCC, bring in the business communities to say, okay, here are all the worlds in which who have been left behind out of global markets. We're asking them to climate mitigate, to lower emissions they don't even have. We're asking them to actually not develop their economies and their businesses and their practices, and that directly impacts you. Help them figure out how do they do that in a clean way, then be involved at the actual global international framework level, advocating for just transitions. Because guess who has the biggest block in representation at the UN climate change talks? The fossil fuel industry. That should not surprise any one of us. When I talk about injustice, these are not just my lefty politics. These are facts. The fossil fuel industry should not have a seat at the table. But if they're gonna have a seat at the table, then we need to be really mouthy and loud and start calling for just transitions in those industries. That is where you can be an effective advocate and activist, to Heidi's point. And as for value-based decisions, because I know we have a minute left, And by the way, Jocelyn, I'm happy to hang out if that's something you want. As for value-based decisions, same thing, right? We need to be the people who are speaking about values. Let's get uncomfortable, or rather, let's get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Let's get comfortable with saying some of these uncomfortable things that we've all been raised to say, oh no, we do not talk about politics, race, religion at the dinner table. I'm sorry, unless we have these conversations at a global scale, at the community level, at the family table, with our donors, with our boards, with our staff, with our, and also stop using the word beneficiary, with the people we are called to, we are supposed to be serving. Unless we have these conversations, we're not going to change much. So that's how we introduce value-based decisions. And if white people can be the people who do hold power, can be the leaders of that, to say, sorry, we need policies, say to our policymakers and say to our donors, so grateful and so wonderful that you want to channel all these funds into, let's say, Ukraine or whatever next crisis comes along. Advocate for unrestricted funds that allow us as experts who know how to better respond to crises, so that when Heidi speaks with such impassioned pleas and tells you what's going on in Sudan, we're not hamstrung. Because we all know the wastage that is ongoing in Ukraine as well. We've all seen it happen over and over and over again. We've lost track, right, of the crises in which this happens. There's no need for our system that we work in, to be this broken. So we can fix our systems as well, our very own aid system. So that's where I see these are small tweaks, small conversations, and we could be doing them right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Amali. Those are really, really helpful ways to act. Alyssa also shared the website for Amali's organization, Climate Refugees, in the chat. If you are moved, make a donation to Climate Refugees, follow them on social media, join the mailing list. There are many videos, so you can dive in and get even deeper in climate displacement, as Amali has shared with us today. But huge thanks to you, Amali, for joining us. Thank you all to my Alight colleagues and friends and supporters for joining us today. So nice to see you. Thank you for all your questions and reflections. This was such a nice way to honor and celebrate World Refugee Day. So thank you all, and we will see you again soon.